All right, let's jump straight into this explainer. Today we're unpacking Monero and how it completely reimagines digital privacy and economics. We're going to explore a really fascinating tension here. On one side, you have this uncompromising tech built for absolute, ironclad anonymity. But on the other side, an unprecedented global regulatory crackdown that's unfolding right now in 2026. So, we're going to look at exactly how this stuff works, why governments worldwide are having such a massive reaction to it, and how users are constantly adapting to this rapidly shifting landscape.
We really have a lot of fascinating ground to cover today. We'll start with point 1, the transparent ledger problem. Then we'll move into point 2, how Monero's privacy works, and point 3, the power of fungibility. After that, we'll hit point 4, the tail emission strategy, followed by point 5, the 2026 regulatory crackdown. And finally, we'll wrap things up with point 6, surviving the privacy ban.
All right, section 1, the transparent ledger problem. Let's start by looking at the specific, foundational flaw that even makes a network like Monero necessary in the first place. So think about your own everyday bank account. To move money around in the traditional system, you essentially have to rely entirely on centralized third parties. You're putting all your trust in them to honestly maintain these closed ledgers and, safeguard your financial privacy. Plus, because banks lend out most of the deposits they hold, that's the whole fractional reserve banking system, you don't actually have your physical money sitting in a vault with your name on it. What you hold is basically an IOU from the bank. That places you entirely at the mercy of their financial health, potential negligence, or just shifting corporate policies. Now, the crypto revolution initially tried to solve this exact trust issue. Bitcoin brilliantly decentralized the network, totally removing the need for that middleman. But it introduced a massive new flaw. It runs on a completely transparent public ledger. That means literally anyone in the world with an internet connection can see every single transaction. They can trace your wealth, your spending habits, your entire financial history, forever. So you're essentially trading institutional surveillance for public surveillance. And that is a pretty significant privacy trade-off, right? Which brings us to section 2, how Monero's privacy works. To fix this glaring hole in digital cash, Monero was built from the ground up with mandatory, default privacy layered directly into its core architecture.
So how does it actually pull this off? Well, Monero uses a really fascinating three-pronged approach. Step 1, ring signatures. These hide the sender by mixing your spend with decoys pulled straight from the blockchain. Step 2, stealth addresses. These hide the recipient by generating one-time disposable destinations for every single transaction. And step 3, RingCT, or ring confidential transactions. This cryptographically masks the exact amount of money being transferred, while still mathematically proving to the whole network that no new coins were falsely created out of thin air. To really wrap your head around that first layer, think of ring signatures kind of like a leaked memo signed by an anonymous high-ranking White House official. You know for an absolute fact that someone in that very specific, authorized group signed the document, right? But it is mathematically impossible to pinpoint exactly which individual it was. In Monero, your real transaction is mixed in with others, giving everyone in that ring complete plausible deniability. And because this privacy is mandatory for absolutely everyone, there's no unique subset of users who stick out from the crowd.
Moving right along to section 3, the power of fungibility. Let's see how this mandatory privacy actually builds into an incredible economic superpower. So, fungibility. It's kind of a dense word, but it simply means that any one unit of a currency can be mutually substituted and is functionally identical to another. Think about it. An ounce of pure gold is an ounce of pure gold. You don't care where it was mined last week. Imagine if a coffee shop rejected your $20 bill just because the person who held it 3 years ago committed a crime. That's a lack of fungibility. Truly sound money has to be fungible, so merchants don't have to constantly run background checks on the cash you're handing them. And this is exactly where the difference between these networks becomes super stark. With Bitcoin, coins that get associated with hacks or illicit activities can be tracked and then permanently blacklisted by major centralized exchanges. This means some Bitcoins literally become tainted, making them practically worth less than clean ones. But Monero's complete default privacy guarantees that no single coin can ever be tainted. Because you literally cannot trace the history of any particular XMR, one Monero is always functionally identical to any other one Monero. All right, section 4, the tail emission strategy. Beyond just privacy, Monero actually makes a radically different economic bet to secure its network for the long haul. Now, there's a very specific number that is absolutely crucial here, 0.6 XMR. This isn't just some random figure. It represents Monero's tail emission. What that is a permanent, unceasing block reward of exactly 0.6 XMR that gets given to miners forever. Even after the initial supply is completely minted, it will never, ever drop below this number. And that fundamentally changes the economic incentives of the entire system. See, most cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin, cap their total supply. They're basically relying on the hope that eventually really high transaction fees will be enough to keep miners motivated to secure the network. Monero goes a completely different route. It uses this tiny, predictable linear inflation to guarantee miners are always getting paid to keep the lights on. It purposefully, but slightly, taxes holders via this inflation to subsidize the network's security. This makes sure the system remains cheap and fair for daily spenders, rather than just rewarding people who passively hoard the coin. It's a really clever dynamic between spending and holding. On to Section 5, the 2026 regulatory crackdown. As you might guess, this uncompromising dedication to perfect privacy has triggered a massive global reaction. By 2026, as a factual reality of the market, jurisdictions everywhere are aggressively restricting these assets. They're effectively redefining them under financial law. Over in the EU, under the MiCA framework, there is an explicit ban on anonymity-enhancing coins, which has led to full delistings. Japan and South Korea, they've enacted mandatory restrictions resulting in total prohibition. Meanwhile, in the United States, incredibly strict AML mandates have created de facto restrictions, and Australia has heavily restricted fiat on-ramps. Make no mistake, the centralized gates are undeniably closing. Section 6. Surviving the privacy ban. So, how are users actually navigating this modern conflict to hold on to what they view as their financial sovereignty? The market has essentially split into two distinct survival tactics based on the underlying tech. Zcash acts as the chameleon, trying to appease regulators by providing a compliant backdoor through optional transparency. That gives it better centralized exchange liquidity, though it's definitely still feeling regulatory pressure. Monero, on the other hand, acts as the ghost. As a strict technical reality, its architecture literally cannot be audited to comply with 2026 AML frameworks. As a result, it completely sacrifices centralized exchange liquidity, but in exchange, it provides true, uncompromised, untraceable sovereignty. So to actually trade Monero in 2026, users are just bypassing centralized exchanges entirely. They're relying heavily on decentralized exchanges and atomic swaps, which basically let two people trade different cryptos directly with zero middlemen. They're also using non-custodial aggregators like FlashShift. Think of these kind of like private automated switchboards. They provide regulatory arbitrage via non-custodial routing loops. This lets users instantly swap their untraceable assets into transparent ones, like Tether or Bitcoin, all without ever handing over their ID to some central database. And this leaves us with a truly provocative reality as we wrap up this explainer. As access to default privacy is intentionally choked off by major global jurisdictions, we really have to ask ourselves a fundamental question. Will true digital sovereignty simply disappear under the crushing weight of compliance? Or are we witnessing the birth of a totally parallel financial system, a literal hard fork of the internet, thriving entirely in these decentralized dark pools? It is an absolutely fascinating standoff between state transparency and individual privacy, and for sure, one that will define the future of digital money.